the gap, standing for Jesus. Standing in the gap for family and friends. Standing in the gap, one love for all, so we all can make it in.
That in these troubling times that we're in right now, we have to understand that God gave us this word so we can use it in the world today, so we can understand how we're supposed to act in the world today. So we have to stay up on current events. And we have a section that we call the Gap News, and Marvel's in charge of that to bring to our understanding and to the surface some things that are going on in the world so that we can employ God's word in that. And so she has something for you. If you've been following the news, you might understand it, but understand it more because she's going to present it to you right now.
Well, you know, we have so many things going on in the world, but I had determined there was a big Supreme Court decision that came down on July 1st this week. I mean, it's just this week. And that was the end of the session of this, I call them Extreme Court. And that's the name of our Gap News, our Extreme Court.
The Supreme Court is the most powerful court of law that exists in the United States. Its decisions profoundly shape the lives of every American.
We've given a lot of power to the court to resolve questions that are really important in our democracy. So a lot of things in which we are polarized or divided, it is the Supreme Court that effectively is the arbiter of those things.
Some experts, however, find such immense judicial power problematic.
I like to call it the most powerful, least accountable institution in Washington, D.C. Congress and the executive have been dysfunctional for most of my adult life. So with that power vacuum, the Supreme Court is more than happy to take up that role as being the most powerful institution in Washington.
As a response, calls to reform the nation's highest court have gained momentum in recent years.
The Supreme Court is in drastic need of reform. In its current form, it is an incredibly destructive, anti-democratic institution.
But not everyone agrees.
Today's the final day of the U.S. Supreme Court's current term. We look now at several major rulings from the court's conservative supermajority. In a 6-3 ruling Friday, the court approved a power grab by corporate interests who want to strip federal agencies of their authority to regulate public health, the climate, environment, worker protections, food and drug safety, and more. The court struck down 4 decades of a precedent known as the Chevron doctrine that stems from a Reagan-era ruling called Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, which establishes that judges should defer to federal agencies on interpreting a law if Congress did not specifically address the issue. Justice Elena Kagan read her dissent from the bench saying, quote, "In every sphere of current or future federal regulation, expect courts from now on to play a commanding role. It's not a role Congress has given them. It's a role this court has now claimed for itself as well as other judges," unquote. Some Democrats responded to the ruling by vowing to introduce legislation to protect their policy-making ability. Senator Ed Markey said the ruling would create, quote, "a regulatory black hole that destroys fundamental protections for every American in this country," unquote. Meanwhile, Thursday, the justices voted 5-4 to block the Environmental Protection Agency's Good Neighbor Plan, which allows the EPA to regulate air pollution that drifts across state lines. In a statement, Earth Justice wrote, quote, "The court's order puts thousands of lives at risk, forces downwind states to regulate their industries more tightly, and tells big polluters that it's open season on our environmental laws," unquote. The Supreme Court had to issue a corrected version of its opinion in the case after Justice Neil Gorsuch confused the air pollutant at issue, which is nitrogen oxide, with nitrous oxide, which he continually referred to in the decision. Nitrous oxide is laughing gas, you know, that dentists administer. He said this more than 5 times in his opinion. But this is no laughing matter. This all comes as the 2 years after the Supreme Court gutted Roe v. Wade in its Dobbs ruling and before today's highly anticipated ruling on former President Donald Trump's bid for immunity from his federal indictment for trying to subvert the 2020 election and stay in power. For more, we're joined by two guests. Ali Mistal is the nation's justice correspondent, author of Allow Me to Retort, a Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. His new piece headline, We Just Witnessed the Biggest Supreme Court Power Grab Since 1803. And Mustafa Ali is the former head of the Environmental Justice Program at the Environmental Protection Agency, now Executive Vice President of National Wildlife Federation and CEO of Revitalization Strategies. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Mustafa Ali, let's begin with you. Let's talk about Chevron. For people who are not following this day and night, explain the significance of this decision.
Well, this decision actually weakens our protections in relationship to clean air and clean water and the land. It says that the expertise that exists inside of federal agencies, those toxicologists, biologists, the others who have spent their life learning and then being able to help to make sure that our country is protected, are no longer valuable. It says that those who are in the courts now get to make the final decision if you are able to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, or to be able to make sure that the land that you're walking on or growing food in, it will be safe enough. This is a very devastating decision that was made. It should have had a warning label on it that said that the following actions are both deadly for both the democracy, for our economy, and for the health of both wildlife and people.
And can you talk about what exactly the decision, Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, what started all this 40 years ago and how this became so important?
Yeah, well, you know, it started because they wanted to make sure that there was actually clean air. So the original decision said that folks in Congress can create the laws. They then move those over to the federal agencies where the expertise actually exists. It also deals with the ambiguity that often exists inside of the law, and that you need to have those individuals who have the knowledge and the skills to understand the dynamics that will play out on the ground. Play out in the ground in places like Cancer Alley or in Institute, West Virginia, or the diesel death zone that's currently going on out in California. So it was important, and over 18,000 times it has been used, not only in the environmental context, but in other contexts. So it gave those individuals who have the skills to actually keep our country safe the ability to do that. And now that has been taken away.
How do you see this connected, and explain what Project 2025 is?
Well, you know, one, this begins to follow a long line of actions that have been going on for over 40 years, all the way going back to Ronald Reagan, where business and others have been trying to deregulate. They've been trying to weaken the sets of laws that we have in place, the statutes, the rules. And what is now playing out is that we're seeing that there is a shifting of power. Now you overlay that with Project 2025, which in itself is 900 pages of how we will restructure the government. And what you'll find now is that you're going to have individuals who will be put into place who will further weaken the basic sets of protections that are out there, will give business and industry, the polluting business and industry, an opportunity to do more of that so they can maximize profits. And you will find that more folks inside of our country will be struggling for a breath of clean air and a drink of clean water.
And I agree with everything Mustafa has said. But you got to remember, when we're talking about a power grab, who is the power coming from? We know where it's going to. We know it's going to the conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court. But who is it coming from? Because a lot of conservatives and Republicans are trying to gaslight people and tell them, well, we're just taking power from unelected bureaucrats at the EPA and giving it to unelected bureaucrats on the Supreme Court. No, nah. They're taking power from you. They're taking power from the voters, because the voters, through their votes of Congress and the president, get to decide what laws and regulations we have. But when you take power out of the executive branch, you take power away from the one elected official we all are allowed to vote for, the president of the United States. And you give it to unelected people at the Supreme Court who don't change their minds every 4 or 8 years. That can only be changed, upon retirement or death every 20 or 30 years. That's the power grab here. It's taking power out of our hands, out of the democracy's hands, and putting it in the hands of the court.
And the court where justices think nitrogen oxide, such a serious pollutant, is nitrous oxide laughing
Couldn't
gas.
be more on point for how non-expert the court is than having literal Neil Gorsuch confuse laughing gas for smog in an opinion where he said the EPA cannot regulate smog.
Well, in another 6-3 ruling on Friday, justices ruled that local governments can criminalize sleeping and camping on public property, banning encampments of unhoused people. In a scathing dissent joined by Justices Kagan and Jackson, Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote for the minority, "Sleep is a biological necessity, not a crime. For some people, sleeping outside is their only option. For people with no access to shelter, that punishes them for being homeless. That is unconscionable and unconstitutional," she said. Can you respond to this decision, Ellie?
Yeah, so Neil Gorsuch, who wrote the majority opinion for the Republicans, basically doesn't think the Eighth Amendment is allowed to exist, right? Like, this is actually a part of a long string of Gorsuch cases where he has written the Eighth Amendment out of the Constitution. Nothing is too cruel for Neil Gorsuch, and no punishment is unusual. So in this opinion, he wrote that criminalizing people, throwing people in jail for the crime of not having any place else to sleep but outside is not an Eighth Amendment law violation. It is not cruel and unusual. Neil Gorsuch, and I wish I was making this up, literally analogized sleeping on the street in Oregon because you have no place to live to campers, or perhaps people who are camping out because they wanted concert tickets. It's the same thing, according to Neil Gorsuch. And so just like the city or the county can say, hey, you can't camp outside Ticketmaster just because you really want to see Pearl Jam, is they can use that same law to take homeless people who have no place else to go and send them to jail as well. Neil Gorsuch found no difference between that. It is a cruel decision, and I would go so far as to say it is an evil decision. There is something broken. There is something broken with people who look at people who have no place else to go, who look at people sleeping on the street, who look at people sleeping in their cars because they have no homes, and say, you know what? Get that person in a jail cell. That's where they belong. There's something broken about people who do that, and unfortunately, 6 of those broken people control the Supreme Court for the rest of my natural life.
This is a decision written about this former president. It is about an imperial court constructing an imperial presidency, a court that has consistently arrogated power to itself and now is arrogating power to someone who poses a threat to democracy. The opinion says that whenever the president and vice president discuss their official responsibilities, they are engaging in official conduct. That is presumptively official. And the burden then is on the government to disprove that it's outside of the scope of official conduct. That totally hamstrings the government. It's also the case here that the opinion suggests that conduct that is outside of the scope, that is not subject to prosecution, cannot be used as evidence to establish that other conduct that is within the scope of prosecution has happened. So that also hamstrings the government. So it's about the presidency of Donald Trump and about allowing him to go forward and escape accountability.
Let's go to Leah Littman. Actually, first we're going to go to Neil Katyal for just a moment. Neil, I know you wanted to get in on this.
Yeah, I mean, I want to zoom out and not talk about buckets of evidence or anything like that. The big picture here is this is a 6-3 decision along what looked to the American public like partisan line, 6 Republican appointed justices siding with Trump, 3 Democratic appointed justices siding against Trump. And it is a momentous, major decision. And I want to read to you from what Justice Sotomayor says at the end of her dissent, because I've never seen language like this in a Supreme Court opinion. She says, quote, "Never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe he'd be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law. Moving forward, however, all former presidents will be cloaked in such immunity. If the occupant of that office misuses official power for personal gain, the criminal law that the rest of us must abide will not provide a backstop." And here's how she ends her dissent, Katie. "With fear for our democracy, I dissent."
I mean, it doesn't get stronger than that, Neil.
by
Neil,
dissent. It doesn't get stronger.
Have you ever
than that,
heard?
and
Have you ever? Sorry to interrupt you, but have you ever heard a justice be that strongly worded about the state of our democracy?
I have not. And what she's signaling here is it's not just about the Trump January 6th case. It's about every president who goes forward, indeed possibly Trump next year, and being immune now from the criminal law to be able to use the Justice Department in ways the court today calls absolutely immune to undermine elections, to go after individuals. This is according to the dissent, which it seems like as grave a shift in our constitutional system as any in our lifetimes.
Let me bring in a little bit more from Sotomayor's dissent, because she gets into some of the specifics that were argued in court. She says, looking beyond the fate of this particular prosecution, the long-term consequences of today's decision are stark. The court effectively creates a law-free zone around the president, upsetting the status quo that has existed since the founding. This new official acts immunity now lies about like a loaded weapon for any president that wishes to place his own interests, his own political survival, or his own financial gain above the interests of the nation. The president of the United States is the most powerful person in the country and possibly the world. When he uses his official powers in any way, under the majority's reasoning, he now will be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy's SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon. Immune, 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 immune. Let the president violate the law. Let him exploit the trappings of his office for personal gain. Let him use his official power for evil ends. Because if he knew that he may one day face liability for breaking the law, he might not be as bold and fearless as we would like him to be. That's a quote from the majority opinion that she's using here. That is the majority's message today. Even if these nightmare scenarios never play out, and I pray they never do, the damage has been done. The relationship between the president and the people he serves has shifted irrevocably. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. That is all from Justice Sotomayor's dissent. Neil, she's arguing that he can assassinate somebody now. Is that what this majority opinion is saying?
Yes, that is basically what she's saying the majority is saying, and I'm sure that is how Trump will take it. And if you ever were thought about the stakes in November and what they were, this opinion makes them very, very clear. The law is not going to be a check against the next president. And you have to have someone in power who you can trust to execute the laws faithfully and to comply with the Constitution. Now the stakes are astronomical in a way they might not have been before. This is a clarion call for the American public to understand the law, the courts are not going to protect us against a president who wants to violate the law.
Wow. To me, this is scary. First of all, the way that this extreme court got formed was by packing the court and doing some things like, you remember when President Obama put forth Merrick Garland to be put onto the Supreme Court, and Mitch McConnell prevented any hearings for 10 months. 10 months. He said it was too close to the election. And then Justice Ginsburg died, what was it, a month or 3 weeks before the election? And in 2 weeks, they jammed Coney Barrett in there. So first of all, the formation of the court is corrupt. And then we didn't even go into any of all of these corruption, Alito with his upside down flag and Clarence Thomas with his $4 million of gifts. And then 2 years ago, they overturned, and they all testified to the Congress or to the Senate, Established law is established law, you know, which means I don't intend to overturn Roe v. Wade, but that was exactly their intention. They were lying through their teeth at the time. So 2 years ago, they overturned that. In this session here, they said that homeless people should be jailed. They said that all the protections of the EPA, the FAA, the SEC, I can't even name all those three-letter acronyms, these agencies that have protected American people for over 40 years, they're saying, no, they don't have the power to regulate and keep us safe. And not only that, we're smarter than them, even though we don't know the difference between laughing gas and smog. And then they said a criminal president is immune from being prosecuted. So yes, he can weaponize the Department of Justice. Trump has already said if he gets elected, he's going to have a military tribunal for Liz Cheney. But he can assassinate his opponent. He can do anything illegal that he wants to do in his quote unquote official capacity. All right, I've gone on. What do you think about that, honey?
Well, I can only reflect back to why we put our ministry into context. And, you know, there's a 24/7 spiritual warfare going on.
Yes.
And it's always going on. We're
Yes.
in war. We need to be prepared. The Word of God prepares us. And that's why I also always stress Micah. Because Micah doesn't say, what does God want? He says, what does God require of us? Okay? And the first thing is justice. Justice. For a man to be above the law, that's not justice.
Not at all.
And the Bible doesn't put anybody above God's law.
No.
And so, but then it talks about mercy too. And talks about the not getting out in front of God, being humble and all that. That's why I keep stressing these things and all that. I also, while I stress those things, I'm also confident in the fact of who is sitting on the throne.
Yes.
And so, you know, people can have their little time or their little say and all that kind of thing, but in the end, they're gonna have to account for what they've done. And I don't see a lot of this, what I'm seeing out of this politics, because you know, politics to me is, I don't see any of that complying with Micah 6:8.
On every point, it is not, and you know, it's ironic that we're on death. What comes next? Because people are going to have to pay for the sins and the crimes that they commit in life. But that's after they die. While they're alive, they should also have to pay when they commit crimes. And this extreme, corrupt court is saying, no, we like for somebody to be able to be a criminal and be our president and commit crimes and get away with it. And so that's one thing. But just look at all the other things that they've turned our Constitution upside down. And they're sitting up there in their black robes like, hey, we can do it and can't nobody do nothing to us.
You know, so much going on with in current events that, you know, we're contemplating breaking off Gap News into its own little thing. We'd like to hear your thoughts about that too. But, you know, let's get into our study.